The first time I saw Margaret Henley watching me through her kitchen window, I convinced myself it was just coincidence. After all, people look out windows all the time. But when it happened again the next morning, and then again that evening, a cold unease settled in my stomach like a stone. I had moved to 1247 Maple Street in Salem, Oregon just 3 weeks prior, drawn by the affordable rent and the promise of a quiet suburban life. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere I'd been craving after years of city living. My new house was a modest 2-bedroom ranch with blue shutters and a small front porch where I'd taken to drinking my morning coffee. The Henley house next door was nearly identical to mine, except for the heavy curtains that covered every window and the overgrown garden that suggested years of neglect. I'd glimpsed Margaret a few times during my first week, a thin woman in her 70s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She never waved or acknowledged my friendly nods, just watched with those pale, calculating eyes. But it was her son Daniel that made my skin crawl. Daniel Henley was somewhere in his 40s, I guessed, though it was hard to tell. He had the soft, pale appearance of someone who rarely ventured outdoors, with thinning brown hair and thick glasses that magnified his watery blue eyes. Unlike his mother's silent observation, Daniel would stare openly, standing motionless in their front yard for hours at a time, his gaze fixed on my house with an intensity that felt almost physical. My friend Jake, who'd helped me move in, had laughed when I mentioned my strange neighbors. "Every neighborhood has its weirdos, man," he'd said, cracking open a beer on my new kitchen counter. "Just ignore them. They'll get bored and find someone else to creep on." But Jake hadn't seen the way Daniel's mouth moved silently as he watched me. Hadn't noticed how Margaret's curtains twitched whenever I came or went. He hadn't felt the weight of their constant surveillance. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday evening in late September. I'd been grilling burgers on my back patio, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the privacy of my fenced yard. The smell of charcoal and meat filled the air, and I was finally starting to feel at home in my new place. That's when I heard the whisper. It was so soft I almost missed it, carried on the evening breeze like a secret meant only for me. "We see you, Michael." My name. They knew my name. I spun around, scanning the fence line and the darkening corners of my yard. Nothing, just shadows and the gentle rustle of leaves. But the whisper had been real. I was certain of it. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish but unable to shake the certainty that someone had been there. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the distant sound of traffic on the main road. I stood there for several minutes, every nerve-ending alert, before finally retreating inside with my half-cooked dinner. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Every creak and groan seemed amplified, every shadow beyond my bedroom window potentially sinister. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with watching eyes and whispered threats. The next morning brought no relief. As I stumbled to the kitchen for coffee, still groggy from my restless night, I glanced out the window toward the Henley house. Daniel stood in their backyard, perfectly still, facing my kitchen window. Our eyes met through the glass, and he raised one pale hand in what might have been a wave. I jerked back from the window so quickly I knocked over my empty coffee mug, sending it crashing to the tile floor. When I worked up the courage to look again, he was gone. The incidents escalated from there. Items began disappearing from my yard. A garden hose, a welcome mat, a ceramic planter my mother had given me as a housewarming gift. Each theft was small, almost insignificant, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was taking my things. I installed a motion sensor light by my back door and bought a security camera for the front porch. The light triggered constantly throughout the night, flooding my backyard with harsh white illumination. But the camera never captured anything more than wind-blown leaves and the occasional stray cat. Still, I felt watched. Constantly, oppressively watched. The whispers started happening more frequently, always when I was alone, always just at the edge of hearing. Sometimes it was my name, drawn out long and sibilant. Other times it was fragments of observation. "He's afraid now," or "so much like the others." The others. That phrase stuck with me, burrowing into my thoughts like a splinter. What others? Had there been previous tenants who'd experienced this same harassment? I tried researching the property online but found little beyond basic real estate records. The house had changed hands frequently over the past decade, which should have been a red flag I'd overlooked in my eagerness to escape city rent prices. 3 weeks into October, I decided to confront the Henleys directly. I'd had enough of the watching, the whispers, the constant feeling that my privacy was being violated. I marched across our adjoining lawns and knocked firmly on their front door. Margaret answered, her pale eyes narrowing as she took in my determined expression. She was smaller than I'd expected, barely reaching my shoulder. But there was something predatory in her posture that made me take an involuntary step backward. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight rasp of a longtime smoker. "I want to talk about your son," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "About the watching and the other things." Her thin lips curved into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Daniel is a good boy. He doesn't bother anyone. He stands in your yard staring at my house for hours. I've heard whispering coming from your property. Items have gone missing from my yard." The words tumbled out in a rush, sounding paranoid even to my own ears. Margaret's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "You seem upset, Michael. Perhaps you should consider moving somewhere more suitable for someone with your particular sensitivities." The way she said my name with that same sibilant emphasis as the whispers made my blood run cold. "How do you know my name?" "It's a small neighborhood. We know all our neighbors." She began to close the door, then paused. "You should be more careful, Michael. Young men living alone? Well, accidents happen." The door closed with a soft click, leaving me standing on the porch with my heart hammering against my ribs. The threat had been subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to getting their way. I stumbled back to my house, mind reeling. The Henleys weren't just strange neighbors, they were dangerous. But dangerous how? And what had Margaret meant about the others? That night I called the non-emergency police line to report harassment. The dispatcher was polite, but clearly skeptical. Without concrete evidence of threats or property damage, there was little they could do. She suggested I document any future incidents and contact them again if the situation escalated. But it already had escalated, in ways the police wouldn't understand. The whispers grew more frequent and more specific. I began hearing details about my daily routine that no casual observer could know. When I showered, what I ate for breakfast, which drawer I kept my spare keys in. It was as if invisible eyes followed me even inside my own home. I started closing all my curtains and blinds, but that only made things worse. The sense of being watched intensified, and I found myself jumping at every sound, checking locks obsessively, sleeping with a baseball bat beside my bed. The breaking point came on a cold Thursday night in early November. I dozed off on my couch while watching late-night television, lulled by the familiar sounds of canned laughter and commercial jingles. I woke to silence and the unsettling certainty that something had changed. The television was off. I was certain I'd left it on, but the screen stared back at me, black and reflective. In that dark mirror, I could see the outline of my living room behind me. And something else. A pale face pressed against my back window, watching me through the glass. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw only darkness beyond the window. When I looked back at the TV screen, the reflection was gone. But I could feel them out there, the Henleys, circling my house like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but what could I tell them? That my neighbors were watching me? That I felt threatened by reflected faces and whispered voices? They'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. The next morning brought a horrifying discovery. Scratched into the paint of my back door were 2 words carved deep enough to reach the wood beneath. "Welcome home." This time when I called the police, they came. Officer Patricia Chen was a compact woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She photographed the damage and took my statement, her expression growing more concerned as I detailed the escalating harassment. "Have you had any direct threats from your neighbors?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. I thought about Margaret's words about accidents happening, Not exactly direct, but... Mr. Crawford, she interrupted gently. I understand this situation is disturbing, but without clear evidence of criminal activity, our options are limited. I'll file a report and increase patrols in the area, but I'd suggest you also consider installing more security measures. Maybe stay with friends for a few days if you're feeling unsafe. After she left, I stood in my kitchen staring at the carved message on my door. The words seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, as if they'd been written in something other than simple scratches in paint. I thought about Officer Chen's suggestion to stay elsewhere, but where would I go? And why should I let these psychotic neighbors drive me from my own home? That decision would prove to be a mistake. The attacks began that very night. Not physical attacks, nothing so crude or obvious. Instead, the Henleys launched an assault on my sanity itself. Every light in my house began flickering in sequence, starting from the front and moving toward the back as if something invisible was walking through my rooms. When I checked the electrical panel, all the breakers were in their proper positions. The whispers came from inside now, emanating from walls and vents and empty rooms. Sometimes I could almost make out conversations, discussions about timing and methods and the best ways to make someone disappear without a trace. I found muddy footprints on my kitchen floor, though every door and window remained locked. My furniture was rearranged while I slept, subtle changes that made familiar spaces feel alien and wrong. Pictures fell from walls. Food spoiled overnight in my refrigerator. The temperature in certain rooms would plummet without warning, leaving me shivering and gasping in inexplicable cold. Through it all, I caught glimpses of the Henleys watching from their windows. Margaret's skeletal frame silhouetted against backlit curtains, Daniel's pale face pressed against glass like a fish in an aquarium. I installed more cameras, bought motion detectors, even hired a security company to monitor my house. Nothing worked. The equipment malfunctioned. Cameras showed empty rooms when I heard clear sounds of movement. Sensors triggered randomly throughout the night. Sleep became impossible. I would lie in bed listening to footsteps in my attic, to voices discussing my vulnerabilities in hushed clinical tones. Sometimes I could swear I felt breath on my neck, cold fingers touching my skin while I lay paralyzed with terror. The final straw came on a Sunday morning in late November. I stumbled to my bathroom, exhausted from another sleepless night, and found a message written in the steam on my mirror. Time to go. But it was what I discovered in my bedroom that finally broke me. Scattered across my pillow were dozens of photographs, pictures of me sleeping, eating, showering, going about my daily routine completely unaware that I was being watched. The angles suggested the photos had been taken from inside my house, from rooms where no one should have been able to hide. At the bottom of the pile was an older photograph yellowed with age. It showed a young man about my age standing in what I now recognized as my living room. He was smiling at the camera, unaware that he was posing for what looked like his last picture. On the back, in spidery handwriting, someone had written, "Timothy Morrison, 2019, so much like the others." My hands shaking, I gathered the photos and ran outside to my car. I didn't pack, didn't lock the door, didn't even turn off the lights. I just drove, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from 1247 Maple Street and the watchers next door. I spent that night in a motel 40 miles away, but even there I couldn't escape the feeling of being observed. Every shadow seemed to hide pale faces. Every whisper of wind through the parking lot sounded like my name being called. The next morning, I called a realtor and put my house on the market. I didn't care about the financial loss, I just wanted out. But when I tried to research Timothy Morrison, the young man in the photograph, I found nothing. No missing person reports, no obituaries, no record that he'd ever existed at all. It was as if he'd simply vanished from the world, leaving behind only that single photograph and the haunted knowledge that I might be next. I never went back to the house on Maple Street. The realtor handled everything, though she called me several times with strange stories about the property. Potential buyers would arrive for showings and flee within minutes, claiming they felt watched. Workers hired to stage the house reported tools going missing, and the constant sensation of invisible eyes following them through the rooms. The house finally sold 6 months later, well below asking price. to a young couple from California who'd only seen photos online. I wanted to warn them, to tell them about the Henleys and their watching eyes and their collection of photographs. But what could I say? That my neighbors had driven me insane with stares and whispers? Instead, I moved to a different state and tried to rebuild my life. But sometimes, late at night when the darkness presses close around me, I still feel them watching. Margaret Henley's pale eyes and Daniel's silent stare, following me across the miles, waiting patiently for the right moment to welcome me home again. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, I hear whispers carrying on the wind. Fragments of familiar voices discussing their new neighbors, their new project, their next collection of photographs. The watchers are always watching, and somewhere in Salem, Oregon, they're welcoming someone else home. I just pray they never find me again. When I bought the house at 824 Pine Ridge Drive in Spokane, Washington, the previous owner seemed almost desperate to sell. Sandra Walsh was a woman in her 50s with prematurely gray hair and nervous hands that never stopped moving. She knocked $15,000 off the asking price without me even negotiating. And when I asked why she was selling, her only response was, "Some houses aren't meant for everyone, Mr. Patterson." I should have listened to that warning. The house itself was everything I'd been looking for. A 1960s split level with 3 bedrooms, a spacious basement, and enough land to give me privacy from my neighbors. After my divorce, I needed space to think, to rebuild my life without Linda's constant criticism echoing through cramped apartment walls. At 34, I was starting over, and this house felt like the perfect place to do it. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with families who kept to themselves and retirees who waved politely from behind their perfectly maintained lawns. My immediate neighbors seemed friendly enough. The Kowalskis to my left were a retired couple who loved gardening, and to my right lived Janet Muller, a single woman about my age who worked as a nurse at Sacred Heart Medical Center. It was Janet who first mentioned the Grimshaw family. I'd been living in the house for about 2 weeks when she knocked on my door with a casserole and a welcoming smile. Janet was attractive in an understated way, with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, and I found myself hoping we might become more than just neighbors. "How are you settling in?" she asked, handing me the still warm dish. "I know moving can be stressful." "It's been great, actually. Really peaceful," I replied, stepping aside to let her see into my living room. "Want to come in for coffee?" She hesitated at the threshold, her smile faltering slightly. "Actually, I should get going. But David..." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Has anyone mentioned the family who lived here before Sandra?" "No. Why?" Janet glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "The Grimshaws lived here for 23 years before Sandra bought it. Robert, his wife Michelle, and their twin daughters. They were, well, they kept to themselves. But after they moved out in 2019, strange things started happening. A chill ran down my spine, though I tried to keep my voice light. "What kind of strange things?" Sandra never said much, but I could tell she was scared. She'd leave all her lights on at night, and I'd see her checking her locks over and over. Sometimes she'd call me at 3 in the morning, convinced she heard voices. Janet shook her head. She lasted 18 months before she put it on the market. That night, as I ate Janet's excellent tuna casserole, I found myself thinking about her warning. But the house felt normal enough, quiet, comfortable, with the settled feeling of a place that had been well maintained. If Sandra had been paranoid, that was her problem, not mine. The first incident happened 3 days later. I'd been working late in my home office, trying to catch up on freelance graphic design projects, when I heard what sounded like children laughing. It was faint, seeming to come from somewhere deep in the house, and my first thought was that sound was carrying from one of the neighboring homes. But when I stepped outside to check, all the nearby houses were dark, their occupants presumably asleep. Back inside, the laughter had stopped. I stood in my hallway listening intently, but heard only the normal settling sounds of an older home. Still, something felt different. Wrong, somehow. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that I noticed the first real sign something was amiss. In my upstairs bathroom, the medicine cabinet door stood wide open. I was certain I'd closed it that morning. I was obsessive about such things, a habit left over from living with Linda's constant complaints about my messiness. Inside the cabinet, my toiletries had been rearranged. The toothpaste was on the wrong shelf. My razor had been moved to where the deodorant usually sat, and my prescription bottles were lined up in perfect height order. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Someone had been in my house. I checked every window and door, but found no signs of forced entry. The security system I'd had installed showed no record of anyone coming or going, but the evidence was undeniable. Someone had been here, moving through my home with the confidence of familiarity. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. The young technician, a guy named Mike with calloused hands and an easy smile, worked efficiently while making small talk. "You the new owner?" he asked, installing the deadbolt on my front door. "Yeah, moved in a few weeks ago. Previous owner seemed anxious to sell." Mike's smile faded slightly. "Sandra Walsh, right? Yeah, we did a lot of work for her. Changed these locks 4 times in 18 months. He glanced around nervously. She was convinced someone had keys to the house. Problem was, we could never find evidence of a break-in. "What do you think was happening?" He shrugged, but his expression remained troubled. "Sometimes houses just feel wrong to certain people. My grandmother used to say some places hold on to their memories too tight." Mike finished tightening the lock and straightened up. "There. Fresh start with all new keys. But new locks couldn't keep out whatever was already inside." The incidents escalated quickly after that. I'd come home from grocery shopping to find cabinet doors standing open in my kitchen, their contents rearranged in meticulous patterns. My books were reshelved by color rather than subject. Furniture was moved just inches from where I'd left it. Not enough to be immediately obvious, but sufficient to create a constant sense of displacement. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It started as a subtle prickle at the back of my neck, the sense that invisible eyes were following my movements through the house. But as days passed, the sensation grew stronger, more oppressive. I'd catch myself spinning around suddenly, expecting to find someone standing behind me, only to see empty rooms and shifting shadows. The children's laughter returned, always distant, always just at the edge of hearing. Sometimes it would be accompanied by other sounds. Footsteps on the stairs when I was in the basement, the creak of floorboards in empty rooms, the soft whisper of voices having conversations I couldn't quite make out. I tried rationalizing it all away. Old houses made noise. Stress from the divorce was making me paranoid. Maybe I was unconsciously moving things and forgetting about it. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with 824 Pine Ridge Drive. The breakthrough came when I decided to research the house's history more thoroughly. Sandra Walsh had been vague about her reasons for selling, and the realtor had glossed over the property's background with generic phrases about motivated sellers and great investment opportunities. What I discovered online chilled me to the bone. The Grimshaw family hadn't simply moved out in 2019. They'd disappeared. Robert Grimshaw, a 42-year-old accountant, his wife Michelle, a kindergarten teacher, and their 8-year-old twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, had vanished on October 15, 2019. Their cars were still in the garage, their belongings undisturbed, but the family was gone as if they'd simply evaporated. The police investigation had been extensive but ultimately fruitless. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication that the family had planned to leave. They'd simply vanished from their home, leaving behind a mystery that remained unsolved to this day. The house had sat empty for 6 months before Sandra Walsh purchased it at an estate auction. She'd gotten it for a fraction of its market value, which should have been a red flag for anyone paying attention. Armed with this knowledge, I began to understand what was happening. The Grimshaw family might be gone, but they'd left something behind. Some echo of their presence that refused to be erased. The manifestations grew stronger as my awareness increased. I'd find children's drawings tucked between couch cushions, crayon pictures of stick figure families and rainbow-colored houses that definitely weren't mine. Small toys would appear in odd places. A miniature car on my bathroom counter, a plastic dinosaur in my coffee mug, a child's bracelet draped over my computer monitor. The voices became clearer too. I could make out fragments of conversation now, the everyday chatter of a family going about their routine. Michelle calling the twins for dinner, Robert asking about homework assignments, Emma and Sophie giggling over some private joke. But these weren't residual hauntings or psychic impressions. These voices responded to my presence. "Daddy's not Daddy," I heard Emma whisper one evening as I sat watching television. "He doesn't belong here," Sophie agreed. "This is our house." I spun around, but saw only my empty living room. Yet the sensation of being observed was stronger than ever, as if invisible children were standing just beyond my peripheral vision, studying me with the calculating intensity that only 8-year-olds could manage. That night I called Janet and asked if we could talk. She invited me over for coffee and I found myself pouring out the whole story. The rearranged items, the voices, the research I'd done about the missing family. Janet listened without interruption, her green eyes growing more concerned as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "David," she said finally, "I think you need to leave that house. I can't just abandon everything. I put my life savings into that place. Your life savings won't matter if you lose your sanity. Or worse." She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Sandra used to tell me things she made me promise never to repeat. But I think you need to know." Janet's revelations were terrifying in their specificity. Sandra had experienced everything I was going through, but the manifestations had grown progressively more aggressive during her time in the house. Doors would slam shut, trapping her in rooms. The water would turn scalding hot while she showered. She'd wake up to find threatening messages written in condensation on her bedroom windows. She said the family was angry about someone else living in their space, Janet continued. Toward the end, she was convinced they were trying to make her disappear too, to add her to whatever happened to them. "That's insane," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. "Is it? The Grimshaws vanished without a trace from that house. Sandra fled after 18 months of psychological torture. How long do you think it'll be before you're the one who goes missing?" I spent that night at Janet's house, grateful for her spare bedroom and the normal, untainted atmosphere of her home. But I couldn't hide there forever. Eventually, I'd have to face whatever was waiting for me at 824 Pine Ridge Drive. When I returned the next morning, I knew immediately that something had changed. The house felt different, heavier somehow, charged with malevolent intent. As I stepped through the front door, I heard Emma's voice, clear as if she were standing right beside me. "Welcome home, Daddy." The living room had been transformed overnight. My furniture was arranged exactly as it appeared in old family photos I'd found online. Photos of the Grimshaw family in happier times. My books had been replaced with children's stories. My adult magazines had vanished, replaced by parenting journals and school newsletters from 2019. It was as if the house was trying to force me into Robert Grimshaw's role, to make me part of a family that no longer existed. In the kitchen, I found breakfast prepared. 4-place settings with eggs and toast growing cold. Orange juice poured into glasses decorated with cartoon characters. One of the plates had a name written in ketchup. David. The message was clear. I wasn't just an unwelcome intruder anymore. I was being recruited. That's when I understood the truth about 824 Pine Ridge Drive. The house wasn't just haunted by the Grimshaw family. It had consumed them, absorbed them into its very structure. They'd become part of the building itself, trapped in an eternal domestic routine that required 4 participants to function, and now they needed a replacement for Robert. I ran upstairs to pack, determined to leave immediately, but found my bedroom door locked from the inside. Through the keyhole, I could hear movement, someone going through my dresser drawers, laying out clothes for the day ahead. "Daddy needs to get ready for work," Michelle's voice drifted through the door. "The girls are waiting for breakfast." I pounded on the door, shouting that I wasn't their father, that I didn't belong here. But the voices only laughed, the sound echoing through the house like wind chimes made of broken glass. When the door finally opened, I found my room completely transformed. The walls were covered with family photos, Pictures of me with Michelle and the twins that I'd never posed for. Vacation snapshots from trips I'd never taken. Christmas mornings filled with impossible memories. In the dresser mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection and nearly screamed. For just a moment, I looked exactly like Robert Grimshaw. Same receding hairline, same tired eyes, same resigned expression of a man trapped in circumstances beyond his control. I fled the house that afternoon, taking only what I could carry and leaving everything else behind. Let the bank foreclose on the mortgage, let my credit be ruined. Some prices were too high to pay, but even now, 6 months later and living 3 states away, I sometimes wake up to the sound of children calling daddy in voices that seem to carry impossible distances. I've changed my name, my phone number, my entire identity, but I can't shake the feeling that the house on Pine Ridge Drive is still waiting for me. Because families should stay together, Emma whispers in my dreams, and daddy shouldn't abandon his little girls. I've heard through mutual friends that 824 Pine Ridge Drive is on the market again. The new owner lasted only 2 months before fleeing in the middle of the night. The realtor is having trouble showing the property. Potential buyers report feeling unwelcome, as if they're intruding on a family gathering. But eventually someone will buy it. Someone desperate enough or naive enough to ignore the warnings. And when they do, the house will welcome them home with the patient, terrible love of a family that refuses to let go of what it believes belongs to them. I just pray it's not someone like me. Someone alone, vulnerable, looking for a fresh start in what seems like the perfect home. Because some houses don't just remember their past, they devour it. The apartment complex at 4200 Riverside Boulevard in Boise, Idaho wasn't much to look at. A converted 1980s office building with narrow hallways and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a sickly yellow tint. But the rent was cheap. Utilities were included, and most importantly, it was available immediately. After losing my job at the marketing firm and burning through my savings during 3 months of unemployment, I couldn't afford to be picky. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 28 years old, and I've always been what you'd call a night person. While most people struggled with insomnia, I thrived in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. It's when I did my best work. Whether that was job hunting online, working on freelance projects, or just thinking through life's complications without the noise of daytime distractions. The apartment was a studio on the 3rd floor, Unit 3C, with a small kitchenette, a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, and a single window that faced the parking lot. Not glamorous, but it was mine. And after 2 weeks of sleeping in my car, having my own space felt like luxury. The building manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a heavy-set woman in her 60s who spoke in rapid bursts and seemed genuinely concerned about her tenants' well-being. During the brief tour before I signed the lease, she'd pointed out the building's quirks: the elevator that sometimes got stuck between floors, the water pressure that was best in the early morning, the way sound carried through the thin walls. Most of our residents are quiet folks, she'd assured me, handing over the keys. Retirees, night shift workers, people who keep to themselves. You shouldn't have any problems. But Mrs. Rodriguez had failed to mention the Castellis. Vincent and Maria Castelli lived in Unit 3B, right next door to me. They appeared to be in their 40s, though it was hard to tell for certain because I only ever saw them in passing, brief glimpses as they hurried down the hallway or slipped into their apartment. Vincent was thin and pale with nervous eyes that never seemed to focus on any one thing for long. Maria was equally gaunt, with graying brown hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, and the hollow-cheeked look of someone who didn't eat regularly. What made them notable wasn't their appearance, but their schedule. The Castellis were active exclusively at night. While the rest of the building settled into sleep around 10 or 11 p.m., the apartment next door came alive with activity. I'd hear their door opening and closing at all hours, footsteps in the hallway, muffled conversations that carried through the thin walls. At first, I assumed they were night shift workers like me, people whose circadian rhythms had adapted to nocturnal life. But their activities were strange. It started with the smell. Around 2 a.m. most nights, a sharp chemical odor would seep through the walls, something like bleach mixed with acetone, acrid and eye-watering. It was strongest near the bathroom we shared a wall with. and it would linger for hours before gradually fading by dawn. Then there were the sounds. Not the normal sounds of people living their lives, watching TV, cooking dinner, having conversations. Instead, I heard scraping noises like furniture being dragged across the floor. Rhythmic tapping, as if someone was hammering something with precise measured strikes. And underneath it all, a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the building's structure itself. The first time I mentioned it to Mrs. Rodriguez, she'd looked uncomfortable. "The Castellis are good tenants," she'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "They pay rent on time, they don't cause trouble. Maybe you could try some earplugs." But earplugs couldn't block out the other things I began noticing. Like the way people seemed to disappear from the building. I'd been living there for 3 weeks when I realized I hadn't seen Mr. Patterson from 3A in over a week. He was an elderly man who walked with a cane and always said good morning when we passed in the hallway. One day he was there, the next he wasn't, and when I asked Mrs. Rodriguez about it, she claimed he'd moved out suddenly for family reasons. "Happens more than you'd think," she'd said, but her hands were shaking as she sorted through her mail. People get restless, decide they need a change. 2 weeks later, it was Sarah from 2B, a grad student who worked at the coffee shop downstairs. Then Miguel from 4A, a construction worker who'd always been friendly and talkative. Each time, Mrs. Rodriguez had the same explanation: sudden moves, family emergencies, job opportunities in other cities. But I never saw moving trucks, never witnessed anyone packing boxes or loading furniture. These people simply vanished, leaving behind empty apartments and vague explanations that didn't add up. The connection to the Castellis became obvious once I started paying attention. Every disappearance followed the same pattern. First, I'd noticed the missing neighbor hadn't been around for a few days. Then there would be increased activity from 3B. More chemical smells, more dragging sounds, more late-night trips to the building's basement where the laundry room and storage units were located. The Castellis would make multiple trips down there, always between 2 and 4 a.m., carrying large duffel bags and plastic containers. I started timing my own laundry visits to avoid those hours, but curiosity eventually got the better of me. On a Tuesday night in early March, I heard them making their usual nocturnal journey to the basement. This time, instead of staying safely in my apartment, I crept down the stairs after them. The basement was a maze of storage units, each one secured with a combination lock and identified only by apartment numbers. The Castellis had disappeared into the depths of the storage area, their flashlights creating moving shadows on the concrete walls. I followed the sound of their voices, keeping to the darker corners and moving as quietly as possible. What I heard made my blood run cold. "This one's getting too ripe," Vincent was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "We need to speed up the process." "The chemical bath should have broken down more of the tissue by now," Maria replied, her tone clinical and detached. "Maybe we need to adjust the pH levels." There was a sound of metal scraping against concrete, followed by a wet, organic noise that made my stomach lurch. Through a gap between storage units, I caught a glimpse of them working over a large plastic container, both wearing rubber gloves and surgical masks. I backed away as quickly and quietly as I could, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd overheard. The Castellis weren't just strange neighbors. They were disposing of bodies in the building's basement, using chemicals to dissolve evidence of their crimes. Back in my apartment, I sat in the dark trying to process what I'd learned. The missing tenants hadn't moved away. They'd been murdered, their bodies dissolved in acid baths in the storage units below. Mrs. Rodriguez had to know, had to be part of it somehow. How else could she explain away so many sudden departures? I thought about calling the police, but what evidence did I have? Overheard conversations and suspicious smells. It would be my word against theirs, and I was just the new guy with the crazy story about his neighbors being serial killers. Instead, I decided to gather proof. Over the next week, I documented everything. I recorded the chemical smells, noting the times and intensity. I took pictures of the Castellis carrying their mysterious bags to the basement. I researched the building's recent tenant history and found a disturbing pattern. Over the past 2 years, dozens of residents had moved out suddenly, with no forwarding addresses. But as I dug deeper into their activities, the Castellis began to notice my attention. It started with little things. My mail would go missing, then reappear days later, obviously opened and resealed. I'd come home to find my door slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it. Items in my apartment would be moved just enough to let me know someone had been inside. Then the direct contact began. I found a note slipped under my door, written in spidery handwriting. Curious neighbors don't last long in this building. The next night, someone knocked on my door at 3 a.m. When I looked through the peephole, Vincent Castelli stood in the hallway, his pale face inches from the door. He wasn't saying anything, just standing there waiting. I didn't answer, and after 20 minutes of silence, he finally walked away. The psychological pressure intensified after that. I'd hear them talking about me through the walls, discussing my schedule, my habits, my vulnerabilities. They knew when I slept, when I worked, when I left the apartment. They were studying me the same way a predator studies prey. "He's getting too suspicious," I heard Maria say one night. "We need to move up the timeline." "The new batch of chemicals should be ready by Friday," Vincent replied. "We can take care of him this weekend." That's when I knew I had to act. I spent Thursday gathering every piece of evidence I'd collected and preparing a detailed report for the police. But before I could deliver it, I needed one final piece of proof. Something undeniable that would force them to investigate the building. Friday night, I waited until I heard the Castellis begin their usual basement routine, then followed them down with my phone's camera ready. This time, I got closer to their storage unit, close enough to see exactly what they were doing. The plastic container held what had once been a human body, now partially dissolved in a bath of industrial chemicals. The smell was overwhelming, sweet decay mixed with harsh acids that burned my eyes and throat. Vincent and Maria worked methodically, stirring the mixture and adding more chemicals to accelerate the decomposition process. I managed to record several minutes of footage before my phone's flash accidentally triggered, illuminating the storage area in stark white light. Both Castellis spun around, their eyes reflecting the camera flash like nocturnal animals. For a moment, we all stood frozen in a tableau of predator and prey. Then Vincent smiled, revealing teeth stained yellow by chemical exposure. "Hello, Marcus," he said, his voice eerily calm. "We've been wondering when you'd join us down here." I ran. I crashed through the storage area, bouncing off walls and knocking over equipment in my desperation to reach the stairs. Behind me, I could hear the Castellis giving chase, their footsteps echoing in the concrete maze. I made it to my apartment and immediately called 911, gasping out the address and begging them to send every available unit. The dispatcher kept me on the line while I barricaded my door with furniture and waited for help to arrive. But the Castellis didn't try to break into my apartment. Instead, they did something far worse. The building's fire alarm began shrieking at maximum volume. Through my window, I could see smoke beginning to pour from the basement vents. They were destroying the evidence, burning down the entire building to cover their tracks. The fire department arrived first, followed quickly by police and paramedics. In the chaos of evacuation, the Castellis simply vanished. Mrs. Rodriguez was found dead in her apartment, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the smoke and stress. The fire destroyed most of the basement, including the storage units where the Castellis had been disposing of bodies. But the investigators found enough residual evidence, bone fragments, dental remains, chemical residues, to confirm my story. The building was condemned, and a massive investigation was launched into the disappearances. They never found Vincent and Maria Castelli. It was as if they'd simply evaporated, leaving behind only the evidence of their crimes and a building full of traumatized survivors. The official investigation identified the remains of at least 12 victims in the basement storage area, with more suspected but impossible to confirm due to the fire damage. The case remains open, with the Castellis still wanted by federal authorities. I've moved 6 times since then, never staying in the same city for more than a few months. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in whatever temporary home I've found, I hear familiar footsteps in the hallway outside my door. And sometimes I catch the faint smell of chemicals seeping through the walls, reminding me that some neighbors never really leave. They just wait for the right moment to welcome you to their night shift. The Castellis understood something fundamental about urban life. In a world where people keep to themselves, where neighbors are strangers, it's remarkably easy to make someone disappear. All you need is patience, the right chemicals, and the perfect cover story about sudden moves and family emergencies. I learned that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the quiet couple next door who works strange hours and pays their rent on time. Sometimes they smile and wave when you pass them in the hallway, all while planning how to dissolve your body in acid baths hidden in basement storage units. The night shift continues somewhere in some other building, with some other unsuspecting neighbors who think the worst thing about apartment living is thin walls and noisy upstairs tenants. They have no idea what's really waiting for them in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, when the nocturnal predators begin their work, and another name gets added to the list of people who simply moved away without saying goodbye.